Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations for Change on this wintry day here as we continue to celebrate Black History Month. We have a great guest lined up for you today in Claude Johnson, and to talk about the Black Fives and just really some great and often untold history. I want to do some quick introductions. First of all, I am Tracy Ellis Ward, Senior Associate Commissioner for the Big East Conference, and I also serve as our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. And as I mentioned, this is another installment of a Conversation for Change. We've had several of these since the summer, and as part of our overall initiative in terms of Be the Change, in terms of our inclusion and diversity initiatives at the conference level. So we are pleased to have a special guest today with us in Claude Johnson, and my colleague Stu Jackson will be moderating. So I just want to give you a quick overview of both of these great gentlemen that are going to be here to share with you today. First of all, Stu Jackson, again, my colleague, he is currently serving as the Executive Associate Commissioner of Men's Basketball for the conference. And we wrestle probably daily in office on everything related to basketball. So I appreciate all he does for the cause. He also was a former executive at the NBA many moons ago, where we initially crossed paths, and has an illustrious career in coaching as well as administration, and played in the Pacific Northwest, which probably many people don't know, and was a great college athlete as well. And had some history with the New York Knicks, and has probably more Twitter followers than anybody in my age category than I know. So I'm highly jealous of his social media game. So welcome, Stu Jackson. Last but not least, our special guest, Claude Johnson, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Black Fives. Again, we're very, very pleased to have you join us today. He is known, he calls himself a historian, a researcher, and really just a lover of history. And so we, again, appreciate everything he's done to bring to light the Black Fives history. Believe it or not, Claude was born in Austria, correct?
That's right.
And so he has an illustrious international career as well. And he got his BS in civil engineering, of all things, at Carnegie Mellon, and also a master's in mechanical engineering from Stanford. So transitioning from the engineering world to the history world is not a small feat. He has authored The Black Fives, the Alpha Physical Culture Club, and the history of pioneering the earliest 20th century all-Black basketball team, and is writing a second book right now as well. He's contributed to several chapters in Upon Further Review, The Greatest What Ifs in the Sports History by Mike Pesca, which is a compilation of stories of all-stars listed sports writers. Claude has done numerous media appearances in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Sports Illustrated, Fox Sports, our broadcasting partners, History Channel, NPR, ESPN, as well as Turner and NBA TV. So we're honored and privileged to have him as our special guest today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our featured guest, and Stu, you can take it away from here. One last thing, housekeeping thing. If folks have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and I will be passing those along to Stu as we continue to moderate. And so if questions will come up, again, I will pass those along to the moderator. So feel free to drop any questions in the chat. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tracy. And before we get started, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize the significance of Tracy's efforts on behalf of the Big East Conference, more specifically as it relates to events surrounding Black History Month. And, you know, Black History Month, to all of us at the Big East Conference, to me personally, really is about a focus on education and learning Black history, some of those untold stories, and the people that have helped make those stories, one of which is with us today in Claude Johnson. And I am really, really excited to be a part of this session because Claude's stories are really taking the cover off a book that has rarely been read when you talk about Black Fives. And, there's a part, I've spent my life in the game of basketball, thought I understood the history, thought I knew the history. And Claude and his work have been very enlightening to me. And I hope that his words are enlightening for you as well. So, Claude, I'm going to start our conversation with the first question and just kind of open it up to you and help all of us who are viewing today understand what motivated you to start the Black Fives Foundation and a chance to just tell your overall story.
Yeah, thank you, Stu, and Tracy, for putting this on and for inviting me and for thinking of us and our organization. Basically, we crossed paths as well, Stu and I, indirectly, because I used to work at the NBA, at NBA Properties. And it was in 1996 that they celebrated their 50th anniversary, the league. And during that time, there was a lot of interest in the history of basketball. And I had always taken a big interest in history. And I had read this book by Arthur Ashe that came out just a few years before that called A Hard Road to Glory, in which he detailed really from the 1600s on to the present, all the different African-American athletes and pioneers who had paved the way for the modern game. So, and there was a section in his book on basketball. And in that section on basketball, he talked about these early African-American teams that he listed a few of them, maybe a half a dozen, that intrigued me with their names. And since I was in licensing at the league, and I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and then I discovered that in 1904, there was an all-Black athletic and social club called the Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn. And I just thought, how could that be that in 1904, nearly 100 years earlier, there was an all-Black athletic club, and I'm athletic, I'm in Brooklyn, I'm smart, I'm part of the Smart Set, one things like that. And I'm in licensing, so I thought one day there might be an opportunity to put that name on a t-shirt. How cool would that be? And so, time went on, but that same year, the NBA published an 800-page book called the NBA Encyclopedia of Basketball. And in that book, they only had 3 pages devoted to earlier Black teams. And there were only 2 of them listed. One was the Globetrotters and one was a team called the New York Renaissance. And both of them deserve to be listed, but I was just curious, how come this history isn't being told? And so when I looked at, I talked to the league historian, I talked to the Basketball Hall of Fame, went to different libraries, went to the National Archives, like wherever you could possibly think of going. No one knew anything about these earlier teams. And I didn't know much about how to research. So I started calling the publisher and just trying to find out, well, how do they even know that? And it turns out that you have to go into the library, into the microfilm, or into the actual archives of where these newspapers are held. And so for that began my journey of going to the Schomburg and other libraries. And that was back when you had to go through microfilm, visually, manually by hand, right? So you couldn't do a digital, virtual search. You had to just scroll through like one after another reel of newspapers. And that's when I discovered that there were dozens of African-American teams that were just conducting basketball in parallel, similar to the Negro Leagues of baseball, but for basketball. And that's when I realized, wow, there's this whole other history here. And and so I began writing down, whatever I found chronologically. It's not really a book or a story, but it's just all this information. And I started, a number of other activities at that time, all while I was still working and still doing, my other regular jobs. But I went there, on weekends, sick days, whatever I could, vacations. And, then I found out there were other Schomburgs all around, the country, other equivalent historical archives or historical societies, libraries. And I began to just accumulate all these facts and all this information, all this history. And one other thing that I did is that whenever I discovered a new team, I knew that, at some point that might be valuable in terms of intellectual property. And so I would trademark the names and logos of those teams. And then I did the artwork that went with it to resurrect those logos. Because I recognized back then that really, merchandise is a language of its own. And some people learn through merchandise and through the stories that can be told through that. So that was kind of the beginning. Didn't know where it was going, thought maybe I was going to write a book at some point. But that kind of is where this effort all started. And I just want to point out that at a certain point, somebody once wrote an article that said I was an amateur historian. But eventually, I realized you have to call yourself what you are. And I started calling myself a historian because I'm getting paid to be a historian. So I'm a professional historian, and there's no certification that says what you are. You just have to call yourself that. So I guess one lesson is once you decide what you are and you call yourself that, that's what you are, and people will honor that.
Yeah, well, we won't call you amateur here, Claude. That's a terrific story. So along the way of you finding out all this information and trademarking some of these things and the artwork and the logos, you established the Black Fives Foundation. Could you talk a little bit about just what your mission is here going forward, and what your purpose is and what you hope people will come to understand before we get into the specifics of some of these teams?
Yeah, and so thank you for that. I mean, I took all that information and all those logos, and for years I was trying to figure out what to do. And I approached different companies and tried to say, hey, what about creating a licensing property and a partnership and whatever? And nobody was really interested. Nobody really knew like what was I talking about, and or what to do with it, because it was so foreign, basically. Now, what I noticed is that so when I went out and I decided one day on my, if nobody's interested, I'll just do it on my own. So I went to Mitchell and Ness, and they put me in touch with their sourcing agents and other people. And suddenly I was in Korea, and we were trying to decide and design, jerseys. And this was right in the height of the throwback era. So I was shipping throwback jerseys out of my garage with a sales agency, and we opened up something like 250 retail doors around the country. But it was last call for jerseys. It was just before that whole market collapsed because of all the knockoffs, and then that was replaced by white T-shirts, if you remember, white T-shirts and Uptowns that everybody started wearing. And so I was stuck with inventory and with accounts receivable that I could never collect because a lot of retailers went out of business. And then at the same time, someone from BET Wardrobe called me and said, hey, we want some of that stuff. And then the next thing you know, Big Tigger in the Basement and AJ on 106 and Park and Exhibit on Pimp My Ride and other celebrities like that, were Ludacris, were wearing my jerseys in their music videos or whatever, but it was too late. So, and then because of that, teachers kept calling me and saying, hey, can you come talk at our school? And I never felt like I could say to a teacher, like a middle school teacher or an elementary school teacher, okay, here's my budget or my honorarium or the fee. Because that was just, I've always felt really comfortable teaching and talking to kids. And I have 3 sons of my own. The oldest is 21. Then I got in 2 other teenagers. And basically, part of me said, all right, this has to maybe be a philanthropic thing, like some kind of nonprofit, because at the time it was Black Fives Incorporated. And I felt like you can go talk to somebody, Stu, about like, hey, here's a t-shirt or whatever, but it's not as meaningful as saying, here's a cause. Here's this thing we're trying to do. We're trying to get more people to learn about this history. And so that's when I started putting away money to, first of all, it was a financial hit to have all these retailers owe me money and I couldn't collect it, but notwithstanding all that, I always knew that I was going to do a philanthropic direction. And so in 2013, I finally did that by creating this nonprofit, 501c3, the Black Fives Foundation. And so, our mission is to research, preserve, showcase, teach, and honor the history, the pre-NBA history of African Americans in basketball. And ever since then, ever since we kind of shifted into the charitable, highway, avenue, lane, things suddenly started blossoming in different ways. And so that's, I'm really glad that we made that shift.
Yeah. No, obviously it sounds like your story is quite an effort on your part, and sounds also like a story of perseverance. And please keep going. Claude, you have the advantage of just understanding the totality of the history of Black Fives. Can you just take us back through the early 1900s in terms of the dates or the moments that you think were significant in the untold story of the Black Fives? And I'm referencing even going back, to the first time two Black teams, it was recorded that they actually played back in 1907, and take it from that point on and just identify some real benchmarks for us in that historical development.
Yeah, thank you. And just one word on perseverance. I mean, if you look at the, I'm recently very inspired by the third verse of "Lift Every Voice and Sing." Everybody kind of sleeps on the rest of the song, but if you look at that third verse, and I encourage you to go look it up whenever you get a chance, it really talks about how our ancestors could only sigh about the place where we've come today. And so I've always looked at that and said, hey, and before them, their ancestors could only sigh that they could even be free of slavery, of being enslaved, and so on, right? So if we gotten to this point, then we owe it not only to our ancestors, but also to who's coming next for us to keep going, because the journey isn't over yet. It's a trajectory. And so speaking of that trajectory, I mean, really, and I'm writing a book about this whole comprehensive history, and it really starts in the 1800s, right? Because basketball was invented in 1891. Black folks didn't really start playing until about 1904. They were scattered individuals, but that's because during post-Reconstruction, it was just considered too frivolous to pursue sports when the most important thing was education. You could barely even get into a college. And so, how are you going to finally get into that college and then play sports? And not only that, but there were no professional leagues that Blacks were allowed into. Whatever they did have in the Negro leagues got shut down, before it could really take off too strongly. So you really had to wait until, the early 1900s. 1904, a Black gym teacher from Washington, D.C. Went to a summer school on physical training. It was basically a training for gym teachers at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he learned the game of basketball. And then he went back to DC and taught the game to his students in the racially segregated Washington, DC school system. And that was really the first time that basketball was played and introduced on a wide scale organized basis. And for that reason, Edwin Henderson is enshrined in the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. So that was really the first major, first major milestone of many. And I would say that the next major milestone was around 1910, when the New York All-Stars, which was a team of the best players in New York City, formed and played in the first official game where it was a pay-for-play system, like a pre-professional, almost a semi-pro type of a setup. And Stu referred to this other game that took place in Brooklyn, at the corner of Knickerbocker and Gates. If you're familiar with Brooklyn, there used to be a handball court there. And back then they converted it into a basketball arena or basketball court. And so they had this game, and there were 100 or 200 spectators. But it was the most amazing thing that anybody had ever seen. The all-black audience, the all-black players, and it made national headlines in the syndicated, what they called the Negro press back then, which was, the newspapers like the New York Age, the Indianapolis Freeman, Chicago Defender, and other newspapers like that. And so, basketball took off. It became popular not only as a sporting event, but really it acted as a meaningful social event. They had music before and during halftime, and after the game, they would bring in an orchestra, a band leader. This was before you really had, you didn't really have radio. You had some phonographs. You had people, that played sheet music in their parlor. So, suddenly this was a whole new thing. And before social networking, you really, the only way you could meet somebody, if you were from North Carolina and you wanted to meet somebody else from North Carolina, but you were in New York, you had to go to an event where you knew there were going to be people from North Carolina at that event. And so these kinds of gatherings were about that. And so, that's what I'm fascinated by it, because also there was this epic struggle between the forces that wanted basketball to stay amateur, and then the forces that said, well, wait, we've got 100 people, now we've got 200 people, next year you got 400 people, within a couple of years there's 1,200 people, now there's 2,000 people, now there's 6,000 people at a game. That's a lot of money. And so the players and the coaches and everybody started saying, okay, wait, what's going on here? And it was too difficult. You just couldn't hold back the amount of demand for professionalism. But for a long time, really for a whole decade, more than a decade, there was this struggle that was waged in newspapers and among the leaders and the authorities of Black basketball specifically. Whites in basketball had already long ago said, forget those AAU rules, forget about all these regulations. This is how we're going to play the game. And they had already been professionals since the late 1800s.
Well, Claude, that's a great segue. And if you could just share with everyone, it's a great segue into what was really the first professional team or teams back in the early 1920s. Could you talk a little bit about the New York Renaissance, when actually players were under contract for the first time and began to play, built upon the backs of this growing enthusiasm around the game and Black players?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So during the 1910s, this back and forth struggle, and then you also had the rise of teams in Chicago and Pittsburgh, Washington, New York City, Brooklyn, Harlem, and elsewhere, but mostly they were in those areas. Philly came on board, Baltimore, and but what was possible back then, or frequently happened, is that a player could just jump from one team to another mid-season, from one day to the next and back again. And this was called player jumping. And so no one could really rely on having a strong team from one year to the next. There would be defections of massive numbers of people would leave this team and form their own team. And so there was actually a movement around the beginning of the 1920s, which coincided with the dawn of the period called the Harlem Renaissance, where it finally came to a crossroads, and the forces that wanted everything in Black basketball to stay amateur had to give in to the forces that were so compelling on the professional side, the capitalistic side, the entrepreneurial side. And the man who introduced that way of thinking in Black basketball was a guy named Bob Douglas, who was a native of St. Kitts. And by the way, a lot of these individuals who were around and controlled Black basketball in the early 1900s were actually West Indian, little as it's known, from Jamaica, from Barbados, from St. Thomas, which was back then it was called the Danish West Indies, actually owned by Denmark. And so what happened is, he created a team, and it was the first Black-owned, all-Black, fully professional basketball team. The little known fact is that there was also, before that, a fully professional all-Black basketball team, but it was white-owned. It was owned by the owners of this wrestling facility up in Harlem, the McMahon brothers, Jess and Ed McMahon, who they were also boxing promoters, and they owned Negro League baseball teams. And they were well loved in Harlem because they gave Black prize fighters chances to fight for title bouts, right? So where other promoters just didn't allow that. And they were famously ducked top Black contenders so that they could hold on to their belt. And this was after Jack Johnson had already won. So people were trying to figure out how to obstruct that at the time. But Bob Douglas took that model, and then he basically consolidated all the talent with the money that he was now able to offer, full year guaranteed contracts with health benefits and other stipulations. Very basic compared to today's professional contracts, which are, Stu could talk more about this, but probably pages and pages and pages and pages, however long they are, of clauses. And so when he did that, that basically made the New York Renaissance the only team for a long time where if you had talent, that was the pinnacle, that was the peak, that was the height of where you could go. There were no white leagues you could get into, but you could join the Harlem Rens, the New York Rens, or the Renaissance as they were known. And they got that name not from the Renaissance period, but from an interesting collaboration that Douglas made with the owner of a new ballroom called the Renaissance Ballroom that used to be at the corner of 7th Avenue and West 138th Street. And he didn't have a home court for this team that he had originally formed. So he went to the owner of this facility and said, look, I'll name my team the Renaissance after your building if you let us play there. And so it was a win-win because the owner of the building now could promote his facility wherever the Renaissance played. And it was a very successful, you could call it a naming rights deal, and it worked. And the reason why this was so lucrative for Douglas and for the Rens was that they would actually go on the road most of the time. They wouldn't play in the Renaissance. They would definitely have home games, but most of the time they would spend on the road. And that's that's a whole other part of the story, is how did he finesse and crack that code of being able to do that?
Yeah, well, it's funny, Claude, because he cracked the code somehow. Because then, decade and a half later or so, you started to see Black players enter the National Basketball League, as it was called at that time, which was primarily white. But there were some early beginnings of players then from the Rens and these teams around the country begin to actually sign contracts with what is now the beginning of modern day basketball in the NBL and then the NBA. Could you just shed some light on those names and that story and how that all happened and began? Because that was the prelude to what we have today.
Yeah, and I want to point out that Bob Douglas is in the Basketball Hall of Fame, deservedly so. What he did is that he started going out on these barnstorming tours around the country, where they would play something like 150 games a year, maybe more, and they would win 80, 90% of the time. And what they would do is they would reach out in advance to a team in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and then or in Oshkosh, and they would promote themselves as the colored basketball world champions, which they were. And then that local team would say, wow, okay, let's promote this because it's kind of a novelty for this amazing championship level team to come in here and play our local guys. And what that would be as an opportunity would be, okay, almost like a walking stimulus package or a mobile stimulus package, because wherever the Rens went, people would come from miles around to frequent the merchants, the bars, the hotels, the restaurants, and then go to the game, and they would wager on the game itself. And this was during the Great Depression. It was during the height of Jim Crow. And so you have to ask yourself, well, how did an all-Black team go to an all-white town like Oshkosh in the middle of Jim Crow and the Great Depression, win, leave, and then get invited back? And that's why, right? So first you had to have some kind of collaboration, some kind of handshakes, agreements, business that was done, common ground that was found. It doesn't mean that the problems went away, but and they definitely had to use their own special bus and the back door. And there's lots of stories of restaurants where they couldn't eat or be served, or they had to sit behind a partition so that white patrons wouldn't be offended or shocked, according to the locals. And so, they ended up setting up with this team in Oshkosh called the Oshkosh All-Stars, which was one of the best teams in professional basketball, a series in 1937 that they called the World Series of Basketball. They just arbitrarily decided, we're the two best teams, we're going to play a World Series of basketball, and whoever wins is the champion. And the Rens won that. So this was and it was amazingly popular, because in Wisconsin, they would play these games at different locations around Wisconsin. It was really a brilliant idea. And because of the popularity of that, they did it again the next year. And then finally, the Chicago Herald-American, which was a major newspaper in Chicago, said, wait, time out. Why are these guys setting up a World Series of basketball? We should just create our own really sponsored, all-out world championship of professional basketball. And that's what they did. And so they invited 12 teams. One of them was the New York Rens. Another one was the Globetrotters. Another one was the Oshkosh All-Stars, and some others. And the New York Rens won that inaugural tournament as well in 1939. And famously, one of the players on the team, a person who I eventually was able to had the privilege of befriending, was a man named John Isaacs, who played on that team, the New York Renaissance. He's also in the Hall of Fame. And what he did is he took the jacket, the championship jacket that they were provided after that win, and he asked Bob Douglas for a razor blade. And then everybody was saying, why do you want a razor blade? And he went to the back of the bus and he took the razor blade and he took his jacket and he very carefully removed the threads on the word colored so that it now just said world champions. And with that, not only was it accurate, but it was also already known and accurate, but just nobody would ever say world champions. They would always say world colored champions. And that was a fitting symbolic thing for John Isaacs to do, but also for the Renaissance in terms of their recognition. And sure enough, within a few years, when the NBL started hiring Black players in the early 1940s, some of those players were Ren's players, but then they were also just as abruptly dropped. Every single Black player was abruptly dropped in 1942 from that league. And then there was literally a blackout, if you will, until 1948, when this team called the Detroit Vagabond Kings went bankrupt and their spot was empty. And because they had an empty spot, they invited the Renaissance into that franchise slot, which meant that an all-Black team for the first time was literally inserted into an all-white league for one season. The downside is that they had to assume the losing record of that team because actually they would have probably won the championship. And if they had won the championship, then they might have had a chance in 1949 when the NBA was organized by a merger of the NBL, which this team was in, and the Basketball Association of America. When they merged, they left out the Wrens. And so, it's just one story after another.
So Claude, that sounds like a sports-related form of redlining to me. You're starting, you're the best team and you seemingly have the same opportunity, but the reality is you're sort of saddled with some restrictions that, discourage you or don't allow you to perform. But be that as it may, that sounds like a real step in terms of just the inclusion of Black teams into the white world of basketball. So then you have, in 1950, and these are names that even I remembered as a young player, people like Chuck Cooper and Earl Lloyd, Nate Clifton, who were like, along with Hank Zani, becoming the first Black players in the National Basketball Association. How did that all come about? And I know that, certainly Bob Douglas also played a role in that. But for the NBA, 1950 is the significant date in terms of modern history. And could you share some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, so, the Renaissance were, in fact, let's say, blocked out of the opportunity in 1949 to join the league. But by 1950, some owners started thinking, well, wait, we want to have Black players because they're the best players out there. And specifically, the owner of the Knicks said he wanted to have Sweetwater Clifton. Sweetwater Clifton was considered probably the best center at that time. And there was some pushback from other owners who said that they preferred that not to happen. And one reason they didn't want it to happen was because in the early first few years of the NBA, they were actually struggling. And in order to help their cause, they would book double headers. And the first game of the double header would be a game with the Harlem Globetrotters, who were starting to become the most, let's say, amusing or entertaining team that was around. And their owner, Abe Saperstein, said that if the NBA hired a Black player, then he would refuse to book any more double headers with the league. And the league was under pressure because they needed that, they needed the Globetrotters as a draw to bring in enough fans to pay for tickets to create the revenue that they needed. But there was enough pushback back to say, you know, we don't care, we still want Black players. And so as a result, in 1950, yes, so Sweetwater Clifton, Nate Clifton, became the first Black player under contract. Earl Lloyd became the first player to actually play in a game, and Chuck Cooper became the first player drafted. He was drafted by the Celtics. Earl Lloyd was drafted by the Washington Capitals, and Hank. Also, you mentioned Hank Dezzoni. Later, also joined the St. Louis Hawks, but he quit after 5 games because of just not being able to tolerate and stand the amount of racism that he encountered. So there were really 4 players, but technically we almost always think of the 3. But if you remember Zelda Spoelstra from the NBA, you know, she was always a big champion of Hank Dezzoni. Don't forget Hank Dezzoni. And I had the honor of being able to meet him and his wife. And I gave him a Wrens jersey. He played for the Wrens, you know, as did a number of the other players who were, you know, who were signed in the NBL in the early 1940s as well.
Yeah. So, you know, we have to rely on your research and, you know, your imagination somewhat here, Claude. But my next question is this: you know, the game of basketball, particularly in Black communities, has always had a prominence in those communities, as well as the game, in terms of being a focal point sometimes for social activities. You know, the game of basketball would be a focal point for just generating enthusiasm for the game and sport in general, and a chance to come together. And, you know, you look back in the history of New York and Harlem, I mean, that was always the case, but did any of the Black Fives around the country have an impact on some of their communities? And if they did, where could you see evidence of that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, really the 4 main centers or epicenters of Black basketball in the earliest days were Brooklyn and Manhattan and Harlem, and then Washington, D.C., and then Pittsburgh, actually, and then Chicago. And then after that, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then it sort of spread, you know, so that by the time you had the late 1940s, you had teams in California, you had, you know, teams in between. And there were always amateur teams and club teams that were competitive in one way or another. But what happened at the very beginning is that, yeah, these became meaningful social events, and they actually married music and socializing with the games. So if you look at the early basketball advertisements in the newspapers for early African-American basketball teams, they always say basketball, which used to be 2 words, basketball and dance. And the dance was really important. And it was always the case that there was music. You had to name which band you had that you, so the advertisement would not only say it's on, you know, Tuesday at 8 p.m. sharp, you know, the pregame preliminary game is between these other 2 teams. And then it would always list who the actual orchestra was, because people knew and they understood and they cared about that aspect of it. Some people went to games, they didn't care about the games. They just wanted to go because of the people and the socializing. And so that marriage of music with the game, people think it started with the rucker or someplace with the boombox courtside or a DJ, but actually, you know, it's just been part of the the culture of Black basketball going back to the earliest days. And, you know, the imagination and the history and the storytelling and all of the metaphors almost for the game being a way to elevate oneself, to lift oneself up, to get to another level of fame. You know, that resonated in Black communities. And the reason we know that is because those pioneers and those stars who were professionals like Pop Gates or Tarzan Cooper or John Isaacs, they would come back to those communities and they would mentor the next group of youngsters who were coming up behind them. And then those guys would talk about, you know, their mentors and so on, right? So we have somebody like Sat Sanders, you know, from the Celtics, who would be down at Marcus Garvey Park, right? But, you know, now it's called Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. But back then, that was where all the old timers used to hang out because they were mentoring and coaching and teaching and lecturing and criticizing and critiquing the guys that were coming up, you know, like Satch, and also being tough on them. And this was, you know, when Satch was still at NYU, and, you know, before NYU and after NYU, they would still come back. And so some of that toughness and some of that grittiness came from these communities. Detroit was there too, Milwaukee. You know, there was some overlap with today's NBA teams, and certainly also with with your own Big East teams. Cincinnati had a team. You know, Indiana had its teams and its players. So basketball has always been a really important part of the Black community, not necessarily because of the game, but also because of the meaningful social connection that it helped create, and the mentoring that it produced, you know, between the forebearers and the current players, and then they would give back, and so on and so on. And by the way, that leads all the way up to Rucker Entertainment Basketball Classic and other streetball tournaments and you know, grassroots basketball and AAU as well today.
Yeah, Claude, I mean, for those listening or watching, if you've never experienced a game at Rucker Park and, you know, in the league there with all that comes with it, it's one of the best sporting events that I've ever experienced. You know, not only the game, the entertainment, the enthusiasm, and, you know, when you attend a game, a championship game or a playoff game at Rucker Park, if you're a basketball person, you can't help but sort of feel the enthusiasm and feel the history and understand from whence all of this came and why why you're there that day. You know, it's just something to behold. But you know, Claude, as part of your journey and, you know, all of your research, you know, you can't ignore the fact that much of it goes for naught unless, you know, it's recognized or there's some historical institutionalization of your work. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, in 2011, the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame formed a special committee to actually recognize early African-American pioneers of the game. And then in 2014, Claude, and this has to be personally significant to you, the New York Historical Society launched its first ever full-scale museum, an exhibition dedicated to the history of Black Fives. Can you shed just your feelings on both of those events?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with the Hall of Fame. I mean, and the president of the Hall of Fame, John DeLeva, and we go back to my licensing days at the NBA when he was in licensing at Spalding, actually. And so we always, you know, stayed in touch, and, you know, it's a good man. But I started to become critical in my blogs of the process. I started to write about how come, you know, these guys are getting overlooked. And why is it that there's this vague secret committee, the Veterans Committee, and they get a finalist, but then nobody knows anything about them, so they just get tossed out. And I also I became acquainted with a man named Howie Evans, who was a journalist with the Amsterdam News. And he had started this lobbying and this advocacy for these early pioneers as early as the 1960s, when there were no Black candidates or even enshrinees into the Hall of Fame. And so, I just felt like, well, I might as well take that baton. He wasn't really handing me the baton, but I felt like, well, since I have a voice that's growing a little bit, I might as well use it and start writing about it. And so John called me one day and he said, those things you're writing, they kind of sting. Let's talk about it. And so we, right around that time is when the Negro Leagues, or I should say the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame, set up a special Negro Leagues committee, and they enshrined all at once something like 19 pioneers in baseball into the Hall of Fame. And so I said to those guys, well, why not do something similar? And they, considered that with other input that they had, and they came up with this special committee, which would bypass all these other veterans and other avenues where people didn't really know about them. And then, I was in a position where I could help write up profiles and information and some of the research that I'd done for them to rely on, to be able to say, hey, you know what, let's enshrine this person, this person, this person. So they've gone down that list and they have their own still committee and everything in place. I think they had to call time out because of the tragedy involving Kobe Bryant. And then obviously now COVID, where they've put a pause on enshrinees through that committee. But since that time, they've enshrined, I think, 9 or maybe 8 or 9 of these earlier pioneers that we were writing about, for all that time, including John Isaacs and Zach Clayton, a woman named Ora Washington, who led the Philadelphia Tribune girls to 11 straight Black basketball national championships, 11 straight. You just process that for a second. And when she retired, she became obscure and worked the rest of her life as a maid, and nobody knew anything about her or what happened to her until years later. But now she's the earliest enshrined woman in the Basketball Hall of Fame. What I mean by that is the earliest players, because she played in the 30s, and there's no woman enshrined that played prior to that. And there's a number of others still on the list, but that was an important, those steps were important because I felt like now these players are getting validated. Unfortunately, some of them posthumously, but at least they're in. And then in 2014, so what's funny is this is just how things happen sometimes. When Barclays Center opened, someone on the curating committee of the Barclays Center, and by the way, Jay-Z was part of that ownership group at the time, and he was part of that committee, said, why don't you put in some Brooklyn related Black basketball images? I know this guy and he has this collection. And so they came to me and they said, can you put together a little grouping of images? And so I did. And they said, wow, this is great. And they actually made those into life-size murals and installed them permanently at Barclays. And for the unveiling of those, and you can see them when you walk in, they're in the main concourse to the right and to the left. And you can see those photographs that are blown up, and they're really beautiful. But the opening of that arena, and with that specific collection of murals, the Nets said, what can we do that's special? And I said, well, why don't you invite as many descendants as possible of the players in these photographs? And so that ended up being something like 40 or 50 people that we were able to reach out to and contact, and they brought them up to the owner's suite, right? And so brought them down to mid-court at halftime of this game that the Nets played, and they were honored, and it was a beautiful moment. And one of the people I invited, who had already somehow I've been in contact with in a fluky kind of a way, was the curator of the New York Historical Society Museum. And so after that, he said, well, why don't you do you have anything? You know, and I said, well, I think I do. And so he said, okay, well, come down, bring your stuff. And so I brought some bins, you know, I had all these bins in plastic bins from the container shop. And he started looking through them, and he said, oh my God, this is really important. And that's how this exhibition was conceived. I didn't know what I had. I thought it was protected. He said, well, you know, putting something into a moisture-proof container, you know, it keeps moisture out, and that's good. But the downside is it keeps moisture in. So you just want to be careful of what you put in and what you put out. And they taught me all about really conservation, preservation, and that's why I added that component to our mission, which is not just the research, but also the preservation of artifacts, important artifacts. And part of that also then is the showcasing of those artifacts and of that history. And so that's what that was. It was a 4-month exhibition. We got a full page review, really great review in the New York Times in their museum section. It took up the entire page. There was nobody else there. And that was really unheard of, because I'm just this guy with a bin full of stuff, you know, so, and that was really great. And then that led, you know, from that, I was invited to speak on the BBC in, you know, London, and and on NPR, like 2 or 3 different NPR stations, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, et cetera. And you know, but still, even with that, I felt like there's something more that we could do with this. And I always felt like more people should see this, because an exhibition in a museum just comes and then it's gone. A couple of years later, or maybe during that time, I ran into NBA Commissioner Adam Silver at the Hall of Fame, and he said, "Hey, look, Claude, I want to show you." And he took out his iPhone and he showed me the photos that he had taken when he went to that exhibition. And so I thought, wow, that's really cool, you know. And so you know, everybody knew about it, but it's just that not until now, with this long-term partnership with Puma, they're going to help sponsor a virtual museum that I've always, you know, felt like that would be an important next step in terms of institutionalizing this history, because now we can spread that out, we can distribute it, people from all over the world can see these artifacts, and then we can also use them as teaching moments, as teachable opportunities, you know, that can even be pulled into schools and into classrooms by school teachers. So that's a really exciting next step.
Yeah, and you know, as the Big East Conference, we hope that we're part of one of those next steps as well, Claude. You know, if not for the pandemic this year, we had some plans to actually help brand Black Fives in a relationship with the Big East Conference, which we'll continue to plan to do perhaps for next year, when all these bad times are behind us. And we look forward to continuing our relationship with you. But you know, we're obviously a little bit past the top of the hour, and I can't thank you enough. This has been informative, not only for our viewers here, but it seems like every time I speak with you, I learn 5 new things. So again, personally, thank you for just sharing your story, sharing the history, the formulation of the Black Fives Foundation, and you know, your vision for the future. And this has been very good, and I thank you. You know, any last words you want to say before we call it a day?
Yeah, just wrapping up. I mean, thank you, Stu. Thank you, Tracy, and the Big East. And you know, that point about the educators. I mean, we're putting together an informal group of of people who know about the pedagogical aspect of taking something and writing a story about it, a curriculum or whatever. So if anybody wants to volunteer, definitely let us know. Reach out to me. We're at blackfives.org. Certainly, if you feel like giving to our cause, you can go to our website, just give.blackfives.org. This line of apparel that I'm wearing, this sneakers behind me that Puma has created, that's dropping next week, or actually at the end of this week in retail stores around the country. It's Black Fives by Puma, and so far well received. It's a good way to support what you believe in, what you love, and also it's going to a good cause. And we're here, and we're going to keep doing more. So we look forward to our collaboration and working with you. And anybody again that wants to stay in touch, feel free to just go to any of those sites and log in, and even just get on our email list for updates.
Well, thank you much, Claude, and will do. Well, Tracy, I guess that concludes our conversation for today. Unless you have any other housekeeping items, Tracy, we'll call it.
Nope. Applause all around for our guests today, and thank you for sharing just some great history. And again, as Claude noted, to learn more, please check out their website. It has just some tremendous history and timelines and just some phenomenal things that just, again, aren't taught in the history books. So thank you for everybody that joined today. We had over 100 attendees. And so a lot of people wanting to learn more. So again, check out the website and enjoy the rest of Black History Month. And we'll be looking to you, Claude, again, to continue to make history.
Thank you.